All righty, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for attending the Dormant Seeding Virtual Field Day, hosted by the University of Northern Iowa Tallgrass Prairie Center and Iowa State STRIPS program. Welcome. Thank you again for joining. My name is Paige Schaefer. I will be hosting this event. The great thing about this event is, one, we're able to have it, and two, you're able to view it from hopefully the comfort of your home, workplace, wherever you may be. Just some quick logistics. This program will be brought to you by a portion of Zoom Live, some videos, and obviously listening to me chat for a while. But if you have any questions or just want a comment, I will be monitoring the chat, and there will be 30 minutes after the presentation where we can go into Q&A. If I can answer the question remotely, I will also do that. And if you're having technical difficulties, you can't hear us, you're having trouble with Zoom, feel free to chat with me. I'll do the best that I can to help you with those problems. And if worst comes to worst, this webinar will be recorded and posted at a later date. So if you want to come back and reference this video later, you're more than welcome to do that. Like an old school movie, this program would not be possible without all of the amazing partners and collaborators that we have worked with. First and foremost, the Roadman Family Farm, Hertz Farm Management, Iowa Nutrient Research Center, the Sustainable Agriculture Research Education Program, Farm Service Agency, Iowa Watershed Approach, of course, the Tallgrass Prairie Center, ISU STRIPS, and the wonderful people at the University of Northern Iowa tech team that are helping you bring us this program. So thank you to all of our amazing partners. Just a little bit of background about the Tallgrass Prairie Center. It was founded in 1999, and it consists of 4 main programs: the Research and Restoration Program, Iowa Roadside Management, Plant Materials, and Prairie on Farms. And all 4 of these programs work together to help people appreciate and bring awareness to tallgrass prairie, as well as incorporating, installing, and restoring as much tallgrass prairie as we can. The second collaborator on this program today is the Iowa State STRIPS program, which stands for the Science-Based Trial of Row Crops Integrated with Prairie Strips. This program is a conservation practice that uses strategically placed native prairie plantings in crop fields. And now we're going to meet our speakers. First is Tim Youngquist from ISU STRIPS. He is the farmer liaison with that program. Our next speaker that you will hear from this afternoon is Justin Meissen. He is the Research and Restoration Coordinator at the Tallgrass Prairie Center. And lastly, you will hear from Andrew Dunham, who is the Prairie on Farms Program Manager at the Tallgrass Prairie Center. Tim, if you could take it away, that would be great.
All right, thanks for the introduction, Paige. I'll pull up my PowerPoint presentation here. All right, Paige, can you see that? You want to just confirm? All right, perfect.
We're good.
Okay, well, thanks to everybody for logging on today. I'm sure by now everybody's kind of used to logging on to Zoom field days. When we had planned this, we had really hoped that this was going to be the first in-person field day of the season that we were going to host, but sadly that didn't work, and it's a real shame because it's really nice weather out there. So we'll try to make this as entertaining as possible. As everyone knows, what we're going to be talking about today is dormant seeding of native prairie. And this is just great because to me, dormant seeding, it's one of my favorites. I think this is the best time of year to seed prairie. And I'll go through just a little bit of the background of why I think that is and some of the research we've done at Iowa State. And then we'll talk a little bit just generally about prairie strips. And if anybody has any questions, I think there's going to be plenty of time at the end of the day. I'll stay on, and then Andy and Justin are both going to be very accomplished. Paige as well for answering questions. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to hang on to them till the end. So if you're looking to plant prairie, again, like I said, now is an excellent time. So anytime after about November 15th, when the soil has cooled down to below 50 degrees, is a really, really good time to seed prairie. And some research that we've done, it's currently unpublished, but it's on its way to being published, showed that these dormant season plantings actually result in a higher cover of prairie species than what you get seeding prairie at other times of the year. Now, prairie can basically be seeded at any time of the year. I wouldn't seed prairie into deep snow, and I wouldn't seed prairie during the hottest, driest part of August, but there are really benefits to seeding prairie all throughout the year. But one of the main benefits that you get when seeding prairie in the dormant time is that you actually get a higher cover of forbs, or your flowers and legumes, things like that. We didn't see, there's not a real significant difference in grass cover during the different planting times. So that's another reason that I think favors dormant plantings. You may see slightly more grasses if you seed in the spring, because those grasses require no stratification, and I'll get into that. But basically, as soon as that grass seed hits warm dirt, it's going to germinate. And then, just as another aside, just more diverse mixes result in more species in that planting. So I mentioned stratification a moment ago. What does that mean? Well, these temperate wildflowers, and that would be the forbs and the legume component of the prairie mixes. So that'd be the showy flowers and a lot of the things that a lot of us are interested in prairie for, let's be honest. They need a period of cold and moist. So generally, the legume species are going to need about at least 10 days for most of them, and then anywhere from 30 to 60 or to 90 days being cold and wet to break the cycle of dormancy and get that seed to germinate. So again, seeding, about anytime between now to about February is a really, really good time, because you're going to get a lot more of those wildflower species that would have a lot harder time germinating without that period of cold, moist stratification. So that's really key to think about. Just in nature, those seeds would fall off about this time of the year with these really, really windy days that we've been having. The seed would fall off and then be able to sit on the ground, kind of sit in all that moisture, and then it would germinate after that period of the cold, moist stratification. Broadcast seeding is something that may not be it's not something that's going to work all year round, but broadcast seeding, I'm a big fan of it at this time of year. Basically, broadcast seeding is just referring to when you throw the seed on top of the surface. And this time of year, you can broadcast seed prairie and it will actually end up on the surface, but that freeze thaw cycle that happens over the course of the winter is going to work that seed just down into the perfect soil layer and give it that good seed to soil contact, and then really give you the best chance for germination with a lot of those species. So I'm a big fan of that. For smaller plantings, a lot of the times we're going to be doing hand broadcast, where you just have kind of your basket or bucket or bag of seed or whatever you have, and you'll be going out and you'll actually be throwing that seed. If you're going to be doing something like that, this is the time, the dormant season planting. You really don't want to be broadcast seeding at other times of the year, because again, you're not going to get that dormancy, and you're maybe not going to get the seed to soil contact that you're looking for. So I mentioned you could seed prairie just about any time of the year. You want the seed or the snow accumulation to be somewhat small. So, really a couple inches or less. I wouldn't seed certainly anything more than about 4 or 5 inches of snow. That's going to be a lot. And I wouldn't want to seed on a thick layer of ice. But as you can see in the background picture of this image, so this slide that we're looking at, getting that seed on the surface of the snow can be a really good way. You can kind of see what coverage you're getting from the species, and that will basically work itself down into the perfect layer. Another benefit of doing a seeding at this time of year, this October-November period is a really good time to sign contracts at your local USDA office if you're getting a practice, say into a crop field that will be going into the Conservation Reserve Program, more commonly known as CRP. October, basically the way that it works with their contracts, if you sign up for a contract now, you'll be paid for a full year in the first year, where if you sign up in the spring, you'll actually end up only getting 6 months in the first year. So for a 10-year contract, if you signed up in the spring, you'd be getting 9.5 years worth of payments, where signing up in the fall, you'll get the full 10 years. That's a little bit off into the weeds, but for those of you that are interested in CRP, signing the contracts in the fall is really critical. And another plus, so I'm in the agronomy department at Iowa State. I deal with a lot of farmers and landowners. Doing these dormant season seedings is a really good time to get seed out there, and you're not going to be interfering with other farming operations. So sometimes in the spring or other times of the year, it can be a little bit hectic with different farming operations going on, where this is a time that you can get out there and you're not interfering with anything else, not having to think about other farm operations. I'll give a little bit of background about the Prairie Strips practice. As Paige introduced, so I'm what's called the farmer liaison. I'm in Ames there at Iowa State, and I represent the team today, but it's actually a really large interdisciplinary group that goes, it started at Iowa State, but really includes the University of Northern Iowa and a lot of other surrounding regional universities and nonprofits. You can see here a picture of more or less the team, and this is made up of natural resource ecologists and economists and ag engineers, and just a wide variety, economists, sociologists, all different things, looking at prairie from a variety of different ways. So for about 15 years now, this group has been looking at the native tallgrass prairie in Iowa. What would happen if we took some of this and put it back into a row crop field? And many of you watching this are probably already familiar with prairie strips. And as some of you know, this started at the Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge, which is down in Prairie City. It's really a fantastic place to visit. It's kind of the largest prairie reconstruction in the United States. They've got a nice buffalo herd. There's a really cool learning center. So I would suggest, if you've never been there before, it is one of the real gems of Iowa. If you're visiting, or if you've just never been there before, if you'd like to go there again, I'd highly recommend it. But in addition to all the prairie they have a little bit of ag land as well. And starting in 2007, we put out several different configurations of prairie laid out in different ways in these crop fields, and then began doing intensive monitoring and research on the effects of having this prairie. So we had 4 different treatments. One was basically an entire field that was just corn and soybeans. So that would be kind of traditional, what you think for the rest of the state. Then we tried putting 10% of that field into prairie, all at the bottom of the field where the water would be leaving, basically what's called the toe slope. Then we tried 10% that was mixed between that bottom and in contour strips, kind of like you can see in this picture. And then we tried 20%, both in the bottom and then in these contour strips. And you can see that there's a little white kind of apparatus in about the middle of the picture. What that is essentially a funnel. It's what's called a hydrologic flume. All the water above that point is going to flow to that common point. So basically the collection point of that micro watershed. And this allows us to monitor the sediment, the nutrients, and the water that are coming off of these fields. And the picture that you can see on the left, this would be out of the control field that was 100% crop. This is from one 4-inch rain event in June from a few years ago. So you can see this incredibly valuable topsoil that we have just through one rain event in June, when the corn hasn't canopied yet. And this valuable soil is just really, really vulnerable to different types of erosion, like rain erosion and wind erosion. The other control plot that we had was 100% prairie. Now you can see the water that's flowing out of the end of this hydrologic flume is completely clear. So this would have been, I think, about 83% of the state of Iowa was covered with tallgrass prairie at one point, or really only about 150 or 200 years ago. There's a lot of different reasons why we're not going to be able to go back to converting the entire state to prairie, and even some of the larger blocks of prairie, folks aren't as interested in installing that. But we found that by just putting 10% of that field into prairie, or 10% of that watershed, can really drastically reduce the amount of erosion coming off. You can see that we're not eliminating it, but disproportionately, you're keeping a lot more soil in place, as well as getting a variety of other benefits from nutrient and water infiltration, an increased abundance of both native birds, native bees, grassland birds, game birds, just a lot of different things. And compared to something like a terrace, it's really more affordable. All of this information is available on our website in scientifically peer-reviewed publications. So I'd encourage you to check some of that out if you haven't seen any of that already. Moving beyond the initial research that we did at the Neil Smith Refuge, we found that there were a lot of farmers and landowners that were interested in something like prairie strips on their property. So that was kind of where I started with Iowa State. This was back in 2014. And I was hired to go around and work with some of these farmers and landowners that were interested in getting prairie. Flash forward about 6 or 7 years, and we've moved well beyond the work that Iowa State and myself have done. The University of Northern Iowa has a very healthy Prairie on Farms program, where they're helping farmers and landowners all over the state install and maintain and do research on these prairie strips. And then you can see a lot of the surrounding states are starting to get their own prairie strips programs and research as well. Another highlight that's happened in the last few years is now prairie strips is part of what's called the Farm Bill. So this is available for federal cost share funding through the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Conservation Reserve Program. This makes prairie strips much easier to get. So if you are a farmer or landowner, you can either contact Iowa State, or UNI would be a good place to start, or your local USDA service center that are located in generally the county seat town. There's one in every county across the state of Iowa. You could go there and you could ask for prairie strips, and they would be able to help you get started down the path to get more information and possibly implement prairie strips on your land. The term is strips, but really they can look a lot of different ways. So they can be around all or portions of the edge of the field. They can be around a terrace. They could be through the field on the contour, or through the field off the contour if it's flat enough. They work in different ways. Large blocks of prairie are really the best way to increase habitat for a wide variety of wildlife. Having connectivity between the different prairie strips also helps wildlife. Having these infield buffers is a great way to keep soil in place on the hill slopes and keep it from moving around. It really slows that soil movement and sediment movement down. And then having edge of field buffers is a really good way to kind of have that last line of defense to, no matter what happens, you're going to be keeping that valuable Iowa topsoil on your property rather than allowing it to run off. These can be used to create uniform farming lanes through the field to basically space with whatever width works for your planter or sprayer specifically. Generally, we'll base whatever the width of that planter is and space these prairie strips in intervals that are divisible by that. So you have even passes and you're not having point rows. And again, these multiple infield buffers can really slow the sediment as they're moving across. One other thing to think about, these prairie strips, as a prairie enthusiast myself, I think that they really provide a lot of different benefits to a farming operation or just to the Iowa landscape in general. They provide wildlife habitat, water infiltration, sediment, and nutrient, prevent those from leaving the field. And just aesthetically, I think they're really, really pretty. But combining prairie strips or different conservation practices is really going to be the best way to really protect your soil and keep our water as clean as possible. So here in a minute, we're going to look at a video from the Roadman family farm, and this is kind of an aerial view. And what they have done is they've combined prairie strips. They've seeded some that are kind of in the southeast, and then here, these that are, or southwest, excuse me, and these are that are more to the northeast that are outlined in red are ones that were just laid out. And we'll look at a video of that taking place. But they've actually used a combination of prairie strips and a saturated buffer. And the saturated buffer is sort of an underground structure that filters the tile water as it's leaving the field. So the prairie strips are really filtering that and cleaning that surface water. And then the shallow groundwater is being cleaned through the saturated buffer. So a combination of practices are always going to be what works better than any one practice on its own. If anybody has any questions, there's a variety of different options. There's prairiestrips.org. You can look at the website. There's contact information for myself and every other member of the team. They're all of the scientifically peer-reviewed publications we have. You can email us directly, or otherwise there are a variety of different social media outlets if you want to just look at pictures or upcoming field days, things like that. I think next what we're going to do is look at a video of the layout of the prairie strips at the Roadman family farms.
Thanks so much, Tim. Can everyone see the UNI truck?
Yep.
Awesome.
Okay, so what we're looking at here is some video footage that we got. I think this was a couple weeks ago after the crop was out, and what you're seeing is a team from Iowa State and UNI that are laying out the prairie strips at the Roadman farm. And these were some edge of field strips. So what you see is just an open reel measuring tape, and they're going around putting placing pin flags to mark the edge of the strip. So when they come back to seed, they'll know exactly where that is. And then when they're ready to do farming operations in the spring, there'll be flags that are set close enough that there won't be any confusion about where the edge of that strip is. So it's pretty low tech, but it's something that it's a pretty easy thing that you can add to your farm. Again, there's a wide variety of layouts that you can have. There's a lot of flexibility, both with the CRP practice and just the practice of putting prairie in the field itself. The term strips, like I said, can be just a little bit misleading. Really what we're talking about, and with the UNI Prairie on Farms program, it's really just integrating prairie wherever you can. You know, if this can be a low producing area of a crop field, you know, something that is just an area in your backyard or front yard that's maybe a little too steep for the lawnmower or something like that. Prairie is something that it really is our natural heritage here in the state of Iowa. We're right in the heart of the tallgrass prairie region, and there are hundreds of species of plants, and there are a lot of other species of wildlife that really rely on those plants, and it's just it's a fantastic thing. It's a beautiful thing. It provides a lot of ecosystem services, and it's something that if you don't know anything about prairie, or if you're just starting to learn, it's something that's really interesting. And I would encourage you to either look at the UNI website at the Tallgrass Prairie Center, or to look at the Prairie Strips website and educate yourself a little bit about prairie, and just think about that as an option for your property. If anybody has any questions, I'll stick on later, but I'm gonna mute myself now. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, Tim. Next, we are going to watch a video about actually doing a dormant seeding and some of the equipment and things to think about. And this will be at the Roadman farm. And so I will share that screen with you shortly.
My name is Andrew Dunham. I'm the Prairie on Farms Program Manager at the Tallgrass Prairie Center. And we are today
Can everyone hear that okay? Rick, can you confirm that it's playing for me?
The
Yeah,
video
Paige, it's not.
Okay. Well. Sorry about this, folks. Let me see. Let's do.
My name is Andrew Dunham. I'm the Prairie on Farms Program Manager at the Tallgrass Prairie Center. And we are today, in November, believe it or not, out at the Roadman farm, where we are putting in a prairie strip site. There's already some established prairie strips here, but we're going to be doing 2 different seed mixes and then looking at them in order to further our understanding of what works in our agronomic landscapes as far as establishing prairie strips. We are out here to look at soil conditions with our drill. So, Justin, take it away.
I'm Justin Meisen. I'm the Research and Restoration Program Manager at the Tallgrass Prairie Center at the University of Northern Iowa. And yeah, today we're going to talk a little bit about, if you're doing a dormant seeding, typically you're going to be doing it pretty soon here at the middle of November, up to when the ground gets rock hard. And so we'll be talking about what you want to look for when our soil conditions right, what is the residue level that we want to shoot for in terms of what's going to give us good results for establishment next year. So let's take a look. Today we're going to be kind of going through using a no-till drill and the things that we want to consider with respect to soil conditions and residue. So again, this is November, so we've been lucky this year to have some opportunities to do some kind of residue management, whether that's baling corn stalks, some kind of tillage, but a lot of the times, that's not necessarily something we can do. So what we'll be talking about today is how you can make decisions about whether you might want to wait until spring based on what you've got, or if you feel like it's good conditions and can go ahead and get that dormant seeding in. So we'll talk about just in general, this is our 4-foot research drill. It's very small, it's very agile, it's quite precise. So today we'll be talking about the general idea of seeding. We're not going to actually seed anything today because it's too early. Mid-November is typically a safer date to seed prairie stuff. We don't want anything to germinate before a hard freeze. So let's load up the drill with a filler instead of actual seed, and we'll see basically how the drill works and how the drill interacts with different kinds of residue. So we've got, so this is rice hulls. It's something you can get from seed dealers now. And they're very similar in texture and size as prairie seeds, and we'll show you what those prairie seeds look like in just a second. So we're going to fill up the back box with these rice hulls, just enough to get it to run through the machine, and then we're also going to put it in the front box. Typically we're not using the back box because we use commercially bought seed, which is typically very well cleaned and it's flowable. And so the middle box is designed for more rough seed that's got fluffy material with it, and it's got a picker wheel that'll take those seeds down without bridging, and that you would get with one of these more just gravity-fed boxes.
We're looking at soil conditions and our seed drill. And so this field we're in right now was in corn this year. and we're out here in November. Again, as a reminder, it's very warm and very dry, and we're looking at ground that looks like it's been baled, so they took a lot of the corn stalk residue off. And we're going to start the tractor up and go so you can see the drill in action and see what it looks like going into corn ground without residue.
Okay, so now we're going to kind of look at what how our seed got placed in the soil here, and you can see here again we're really working with almost totally bare ground, maybe in general maybe 10 to 15% litter cover. So let's take a look. You can see here the where the cutter wheels cut a furrow, and then the press wheels, you know, kind of filled it in there. And so if we start digging around in these furrows, we should be able to see some rice hulls that came out. There's one there, and so you can see they're not deep, so we don't want to be planting these more than 1/4 of an inch deep. And that looks like in general what we're finding here. So yep, some more rice hulls, again about 1/4 of an inch deep. I don't know if you can see those, but and the reason that is because on our cutter, on our disc openers, there's a depth, sort of a depth gauge on those disc openers that prevents us from getting too deep. A lot of sort of just general grass drills don't have that, and you want to have a really good handle on how deep you're planting if you don't have a depth guard like that. So because if you do plant these seeds too deep, you will have really low germination, if any at all, for a lot of this stuff. So so it looks like we're doing a good job. We've got really good seed to soil contact. You saw those rice hulls are definitely in the soil, so those are going to be in a really good spot to germinate next spring and summer.
This research drill that we're using is not considered a true no-till drill. It doesn't have a coulter in front here. So there's the disc opener, and then the depth band. So this is unique to a lot of native seed drills or to Truax. And this basically allows you to set this down and makes it such that you can't go any deeper than that is wide. So you're not gonna be able to go down 3 or 4 inches. It takes some of the thinking out. And here's your press wheel in the back, which covers the seed. So the seed is coming down in these tubes from the separate boxes that Justin showed you previously. So this is coming from the front box and this is coming from the back box. And I'm going to spin the drive wheel in the back. You can see it's geared here. I'm going to spin the drive wheel once, and you can see all of the rice hulls coming out of each one of these units. So just spin it ahead. I don't know if you can see that.
Okay, so we were talking earlier about the rice hulls being a nice filler and a good analog for prairie seed in terms of just demonstration. And here you can see the difference. We have our rice hulls in this hand, and in this hand we have prairie seed. So you can see that these are actually the large prairie seeds. So these are all larger than 12,000 seeds per ounce. And so these are going to be in the back box, and we will put a filler for a lot of these plantings, and we'll use something that we want to match the weight, or rather the density and the size of our seed, and that way we can be pretty comfortable that the flowability is relatively uniform and that the smaller seeds don't drop to the bottom bottom, and the larger seeds don't wait until the end until they're metered out. So we were talking about seed depth, planting seeds at the right depth, and prairie seeds being especially important to plant shallowly. So let me give you an example of why we plant prairie seeds so shallowly. Andy was saying in the horticulture field they typically like to plant those seeds no more than 3 times their height or their width, and so let's look real close here at the prairie seeds. So we're going to look at some of the smallest seeds that we have, and just for reference, some of these look like they might be gentians. A couple of these look like we have some prairie clover and spiderwort and stuff. But to compare that with corn seeds, totally different ballpark, right? So these actually are best planted on the surface, and so we've been doing some small scale research trials to look at, in particular, how can we use a drill to maximize, kind of take advantage of the biology of these different species. And so these really small seeds, a lot of the time require light to germinate, and so one thing that we've done and what we've shown in this research trial works pretty good is to actually use the way that the drill works, having the 2 boxes, and making sure, if you have the option, if you're using a more recent, a newer drill, a lot of them will have mechanisms to set different depth for each box. But if you don't have that, you'd want to set them at the surface level to see the smallest, so just dropping it on the ground. And what'll happen is it'll drop in front of the wheels, it'll drop in front of the press wheels, and the press wheels will give it some degree of seed to soil contact, but it'll also remain on the surface. So the other thing you can do would be to disconnect the tubes and just have the seed drop on the ground from the seed cups, and that does seem, based on our research, to improve establishment in some of these really small seeded species.
The second scenario that we're going to look at is into corn ground where the residue has not been removed or managed. So it's just been combined, hasn't been stock chopped, hasn't been baled, haven't done any tillage, didn't take silage off. And we'll hopefully get a chance to see what the Truax drill does in those conditions. When doing this, it's really good, especially as you get started, to make sure that you're getting on and off the tractor a number of times and making sure that the results that you're wanting to get are the results that you're actually getting. And so into this heavy corn residue, we see that the corn stubble that's there on the ground is just getting pushed into that little groove and not actually being cut. We don't have a no-till coulter on the front right here to actually cut all the way through that residue. And so you see right here, if you had a small prairie seed, it would be sitting on top of that corn husk because it didn't get chopped through, and it's chopping through some of it, but not all of it. And so you're putting a lot of seed out there that doesn't have as good a chance as you would like for it to have.
So we've cleared away a little bit of residue to show you what the seed drill can do. What those disc openers do reach the soil a lot of the time, and you can see there is some degree of seed to soil contact with these rice hulls, but it's definitely a lot less than it would have been in a residue managed field. So if we think about what we were talking about earlier in terms of small seeded species do well when they're surface planted, well, that becomes a little bit of a challenge here because, like Andy was saying, surface planting, you do run the risk of those seeds kind of just getting lodged somewhere on the corn residue and dying there, as opposed to being able to go into the soil and have a chance to germinate. So we don't have good research to show that. There are definitely some folks out there who kind of advocate for letting the dormant season do its thing with freeze and thaw cycles. But if you're trying to sort of maximize your dollar in terms of the seed that you buy, that could be, might increase your costs. You might have to do more seed. You might have to seed more densely to get the same results than you would if you had managed the residue first.
One further consideration when going into fields with a lot of residue is that not all of this material will be broken down in the spring. And so we're doing a dormant seeding, and those really, really small seeds that Justin showed us really do need seed to soil contact in order for them to have the best chance of survival. And they're very, very small, and so those cotyledons, or the cotyledon that comes out, when the seed germinates, is also very small. And so if you have, something this sized, and the seed, through the freeze-thaw cycle, the seed is underneath here, you might actually have that seed not make it, or you might not have that plant make it because it's being shaded by some of last year's residue. And there are a number of these forbs that do germinate relatively early in the spring before you have a lot of microbial activity. The third and final run that we're going to do today is into bean ground, and we're adjacent to the corn stubble here, and we'll have a chance to look at the differences in the way that the drill operates in these conditions.
Difference you can see is that the disc openers had no real challenges actually cutting through the really thin layer of residue and getting a nice furrow established here. And you can see rice hulls here that we've got going on, almost like we had, in fact, about the same as we had in the nearly bare soil with the worked up corn ground, or baled corn ground. And so this is a really good situation to have, because once you harvest the beans, you're done. You've done your site prep, essentially. So I would say this is the most, this is probably the most versatile scenario that you can work with, because it is such low effort. Of course, a no-till drill will work really well in this scenario, but also broadcast seeders do a very good job of, spreading seeds on the surface here. Those seeds, we can talk about what the cover looks like. Residue cover percentages are looking like here. Yeah, so broadcast seeding, drop seeding, any kind of surface seeding is a good bet. Especially in the dormant season, where you can get some freeze-thaw cycles in.
All right, so thank you for watching that video, and a special thanks to Andy Olson, our Green Iowa AmeriCorps member, who helped edit and produce that video. Now we are actually going to go live to the Tallgrass Prairie Center shop with Andrew Dunham and Justin Myson to learn more about the equipment and get some more insight there. Andrew, take it away.
Thanks, Paige. All right, can everybody hear me okay as a sound check, Paige?
I can hear you just fine.
All right, so welcome to the shop at the Tallgrass Prairie Center. Thanks for bearing with us on that video, and I do have to especially give a second shout out to Andy Olson for doctoring the audio on that. We were unmiked in the field, which apparently most people would say that's probably not the best idea, but I think we managed to pull it off to the best of our ability. So you can see I'm standing here next to the drill that we had out at the Roadman farm. So this is the same research Truax drill that we ran the rice holes through out there. And our goal this afternoon, or this morning, I guess, we're still in the morning, here in the shop, is for Justin to go over some of his research as far as dormant seeding goes. We're gonna look at some other pieces of equipment that have been touched upon, but we haven't actually shown. So Tim talked a little bit about broadcast seeding. We talked a little bit about broadcast seeding in that video. We're going to show you a broadcast seeder and a drop seeder as well. And we're going to talk about some of the pros and cons of some of the different pieces of equipment. I know that we touched upon some of those in the video, but it helps to see it in person. And just to kind of let people know that, especially if you're doing this, on a small scale, a relatively small scale, don't feel that you have to go out and buy a drill like this, or a drop seeder like we're going to show you, or broadcast seeder like we're going to show you. Paige, would you be willing to share with folks in the chat box the list of seed and service providers that the Tallgrass Prairie Center has on our website? And that is a list that we do curate and we update it annually. So if you're looking for somebody to help you put some of this stuff in, someone with expertise in the equipment, there are a number of folks that are out there that do this professionally. And so if you have like a 2 or 3 or 10 acre plot or bigger, you can contact them. It's best if you're planning a dormant seeding to not wait. Don't plan on calling them in November saying, can you come out next week and do a dormant seeding for me? This is something that you should be contacting them earlier in the season, in the spring likely, so that they can line up, or you can line up seed, and you can make sure that you have the ground ready, kind of like we showed you. So like if you wanted to do some residue management, or make sure that you're coming out of beans. So here in the shop today, I'm going to pass it off to Justin, and he's going to talk a little bit about his research, and then we'll go over a couple of pieces of equipment. So Justin, take it away.
All right, great. Thank you, Andy. So just want to talk a little bit about some of the research that we've done at the Tallgrass Prairie Center. I would say it very much dovetails with what Tim has already talked about. But we've been working on sort of plot-based experiments, very very fine detail work to look at, to compare some of these choices that you would make as a landowner or an operator when you're establishing a prairie. So we're looking at different kinds of seed mixes. We're looking at mowing in the first year, and now we're also looking at dormant versus spring seeding. And we're looking to see how those things interact to help you guys make better decisions on the landscape. So what we've been finding, we've got this experiment that's been running for 2 years now down here at the Tallgrass Prairie Center, which if you end up stopping by, you can go down and look at this experiment. But we're seeing something very similar to what Tim has talked about. Forbs typically, in terms of cost effectiveness, what's our how do we maximize our dollar in terms of these fairly expensive seed mixes? Relatively, how do we maximize those dollars? So the species that we're seeing that really do well in dormant season are some of the forb species, in particular some of the spring and fall forbs. Interestingly, the summer forbs that are really common, kind of like your black-eyed Susans, they don't really seem to mind. So and that's really important in terms of thinking about pollinator mixes. So this is a very pronounced effect in a pollinator mix, which is dominated by forbs. And it's important because that spring and fall component is part of those objectives of providing, floral resources throughout the entire year. So a dormant seeding, based on what we're seeing preliminary results, is going to be something that you might want to do if you're doing a pollinator planting. The other thing is, highly diverse plantings also. Something that Tim touched on as well. That's also something we're seeing. Dormant season planting is benefiting those highly diverse plantings, like we would recommend typically that folks do as prairie strips. The two groups of species that we found to be actually preferring spring planting would be the warm season grasses, and we don't have great evidence that legumes, but there's some. I think legumes are probably, if we had a little more statistical power, we could show that. But legumes and warm season grasses seem to be something that do very well when they're done in the spring. Now, the cool season grasses actually do better in the dormant season. So stuff like your wild rye, your sedges, June grass, prairie brome, that kind of stuff does better in the cool season. So when you put those two together, you actually, you get good results typically either way, but it kind of depends on what you want to focus on. So if again, if you're going for a diverse planting, you don't want too many warm season grasses. So a dormant season planting is going to be kind of your optimal choice for those situations. Having said that, let's talk a little bit more about the equipment that you've got available as a landowner or operator to get these dormant season seedings planted. So the first thing we're going to talk about is a broadcast spreader, broadcast seeder. So this is our new, we just purchased a new broadcast spreader. We have our old Vicon in the background. But there's generally two styles of broadcast seeders out there. This one is a pendulum style seeder. And the spout basically will run side to side and throw seed across the field. The working width on these, is typically 15 feet or so for the smaller seeded stuff. With heavier stuff, you can toss it up, well over 30 feet. So a couple of things that you want to think about when you're, if you do have access to a broadcast seeder, and that one of those things is agitation. So when we do our native seedings, we have a very diverse set of seeds. Morphologically speaking, the size of seeds is very different in a diverse mix. And so what that means is that when we put in the broadcast spreader, those small seeds are going to want to drop to the bottom, and the large seeds will stay at the top. To counteract that, in one way we do that is to use agitation. So let me show you, basically how this thing works. And many of our broadcast seeders, including the other style, will have options to get an agitator on them. And basically this gray piece down here rotates and creates a constant mix of that prairie seed. And so that will help keep the flowability such that we don't lose too much small seeds all at once. Now, the other thing that we want to think about when we're thinking about broadcast seeding is, and in fact, really any seeding at all using natives, is filler. So I think we talked a little bit about that in the field just recently, but this is a place where you can really visualize it. So to give you an example, this is a 1 acre of seed, prairie seed. And so if you imagine trying to spread this out over an acre, you'd have to be really confident in your calibration. And that can be pretty tough to do. And if you're starting out or you've only done a couple seedings. And so typically what we would suggest is to bulk that up with a bulking agent like we were talking about rice hulls, which you've got here. Often we use a 2-to-1 ratio of bulk to native seed. That's typically for a drill. I would probably add to that for a broadcast seeder, potentially 4-to-1, something like that. But the other thing to think about is the size of your project. If you're working with 10 plus acres, typically the volume of that seed is pretty high already. So the importance of filler kind of goes down a little bit as you get into larger projects. But it is still a very useful tool to have. Mm-hmm. Another thing to think about when we're talking about broadcast seeding is seed to soil contact. So we talked a lot about that earlier. With the drill. However, especially when you're doing a dormant season seeding, it's still important to get seed to soil contact, even though those seeds will have an opportunity to work themselves in through freeze and thaw cycles. Now, some work at the Tallgrass Prairie Center done by my predecessor and some other master's thesis work has been done looking at those, the importance of some kind of soil incorporation, even in the dormant season. And I think one of the takeaways of that work was that, it was actually wind erosion of the seed that just broadcasting was a risk. And so when they used a rake or a drag that we have here, that was an opportunity for that seed to get incorporated into the soil, and they saved quite a lot of seed from wind erosion. So even though the seeds probably will do just fine as long as there's you know, the surface conditions are good throughout the winter, it can't hurt to get some kind of, if it's possible, some kind of seed to soil incorporation. So this, what we're looking at here is basically as simple as it can get in terms of soil incorporation, and that's a piece of fence with some 4x6 posts on it, and it's got a chain that will hook up to this toe area here that you basically just drag this along, and that seed will get lightly pushed into the surface. Now you don't want to go too you don't want to go hog wild with it. You know, even a harrow might be a little much for incorporating the seed. And you know, you don't have to have anything fancy either that you drag behind. It could be an old box spring with a little bit of weight on it. It's, you know, could be a roller, could be a lot of things, a cultipacker. Mm-hmm. So, you know, speaking of cultipackers and, you know, that sort of process of seed incorporation, let's talk a little bit about this other equipment that we have, which is the drop seeder. So this is a brilliant drop seeder, and it's in many ways sort of a combination of a seed drill and a broadcast seeder. It works in a similar way to the drill. You know, the seed gets metered through these boxes, and you can split up your seed that way. And you'll see that the seed will drop out in between these two cultipacker wheels. And so that's where you get basically soil incorporation as you're seeding. So it's a little bit more efficient that way. Mm-hmm. Andy, did you have any other things to add?
Yeah, I would say, having used broadcast seeders or spreaders before, one of the biggest things, especially if you're new to this, is to really be aware of the wind. And so it's a beautiful day outside today, but there are some pretty good wind gusts. And some of those seeds, especially the ones that are either fluffy or small, if it's too windy, you might not get the kind of spread you want, or it might blow, like let's say it's coming out of the south and you're going east-west in your field, you might find that you're not actually getting the kind of coverage that you would like, which also comes to another point to make about any on-farm practice, especially when you're starting or when conditions change. Make sure you're getting up and off your tractor seat and getting down on the ground, and actually, again, making sure that the seed is going where you think the seed is going, because you really would be disappointed if you ended up finding out 2 years later that you'd missed about a 3-foot swath in between each pass in your field because you hadn't taken the time to get off your tractor when you were initially seeding. Justin mentioned agitation. And for those of you who are not participating in CRP, but are thinking about wildlife plots or wanting to put something in your yard, there is the option of buying bulk harvested seed, which can have a lot of like stemmy material and leaf material and chunks of stuff in it. And the nice thing about a broadcast seeder like this is that agitator will keep a lot of that seed flowing. And if you try to run that through a drop seeder or a drill, you're going to have results that you won't be happy with. It'll just plug up, and you actually won't get the seed to flow through. That bulk harvested seed can be quite a cost savings if you're looking like for your home backyard or something like that. And so that's a pretty good option. One other point that I did want to make is for those of you who aren't at a farm scale. So if you're watching this and you're thinking, I just want to put a prairie in my backyard or on my small acreage, and I still want to dormant seed, it is a great option. And so you don't really need maybe a drill or a fancy PTO-driven broadcast seeder. You might be going out there with a 5-gallon bucket or a 1-gallon bucket and just spreading by hand, or you might be using like a hand crank chest-mounted, like an Earthwave broadcast spreader. It still does help to bulk that seed up, so use something as a filler, because you might have a couple $100 in seed. And we talked about how much seed covered an acre. An acre is about the size of a football field.
I have seeded a lot of things in my life, and I would be very challenged, I think, to go out and spread that amount of seed evenly over a football field. And so it does help to bulk that up and start out conservatively. It's especially if you're doing a small plot, it's better to go over it 5 or 6 times in different directions, scattering seed to make sure that you get thorough coverage, than to have 4/5 of your seed in 1/5 of your plot and 1/5 in the other 4/5. So, and you can use a simple lawn roller, like Justin said, a box spring to drag. There are a lot of things. You can be pretty creative especially when you're doing small scale projects. So it's a great option to do in your backyard now too.
Yeah, and I'll just keep reinforcing that idea that the concepts are the same, whether you're at the garden scale or you're at you're working on a quarter section, right? Like there's the concepts are the same, right? Seed to soil contact, agitation, filler. Those are the kinds of things that you need. So if you are doing a backyard project, make sure you're mixing everything up constantly as much as you can, because the same things will happen at the tiny scale as at the large scale. So you can also use a garden rake if it's a really small scale project to help get that seed to soil contact as well. So there's a lot of options, and I think really focusing on the concepts behind it is pretty helpful.
Mm-hmm. And with that, I think, Paige, we're going to ask you to ask us some questions out of the chat or the Q&A. And I'm going to move over so that we can hear Paige's questions, because we're not linked to her via Bluetooth. So.
Yes. So our first question is, and I also just want to give a shout out to Sitka Gear. We just got that new broadcast spreader yesterday. So we didn't know we were going to have it in time, but thankfully we did. And thank you to Sitka Gear for providing those funds to purchase that. So our first question is, what is the narrowest prairie strip that you believe would be effective in reasonable slopes? Would say 75 to 95%. Feet be okay. And also, Tim, you can answer any of these questions as well. So anybody.
Yeah.
Tim, go ahead on that one.
Yeah. So there's a lot of it depends with that question. I can't give you a direct recommendation for how wide they should be, but just keeping in mind that slope length and slope steepness are going to be your 2 biggest factors there. So depending on how steep that slope is, say if this was going to be enrolled in like a conservation reserve program practice, the prairie strips would have to be probably placed no further than about 150 to 120 feet apart. And I certainly would go, wider is better, no narrower than 30 feet. That would be the minimum allowable distance. But I think you're on the right track. Whatever the question was, I think it was 75 or 85.
75 to 90.
Yeah, that's going to be a pretty good width, and that'll provide a lot of good habitat. But just keeping in mind, it's the distance between those, because if you have a 200-foot wide strip and then you have 500 feet of row crop ground above that, it really doesn't matter as much how wide that strip is. It's all about the distance in between the strips.
All right, thank you, Tim. Our next question is, they've read that little blue stem doesn't dormant seed well in some areas. Is that true for southern Iowa? And can you give insight on what works for dormant seeding, I guess, and what doesn't?
Yeah, so I can give that a shot. So in general, warm season grasses typically do best when they're seeded in the spring. The most brute force way around that is to seed more of the warm season grass if you want it. I typically, it's also important to not seed too much warm season grass. Little blue stem, though, I think you could seed as much as you'd like. Typically, some in the past we've 50% or 25 to 50% more seeding rates for like little blue stem, for example, would be a way to try to alleviate poor establishment. The other thing to remember is it is not that it doesn't establish. It's just a degree of establishment. So, so keep that in mind, that you'll still have some establishment of your warm season grasses. But if it's going to be a big component of your seed mix, like if a lot of those pollinator mixes out there kind of really rely on big blue or little blue stem as a matrix grass, something that's fairly dominant, I would definitely up that ratio. Now, it can be tricky if you're in a program, because 10 seeds per square foot of those grasses, that's a hard, unless, I don't know, Tim, I don't know if they changed that, but that can make things a little tricky. But
yeah, and then we have a lot of questions regarding herbicide drift and how do you prevent these narrow areas from being sprayed, or have we seen problems with herbicide carryover? And especially like soybean residue versus corn residue. I don't know who wants to take that one.
I'll jump in with some of just the narrowness of the strips. Again, that's going back to keeping the strips as wide as possible, because even being incredibly conscientious while applying herbicide, there's always going to be the chance that that edge is going to shift a little bit, and there is going to be a little bit of spray drift. So keeping them as wide as possible to have the most kind of interior habitat is going to be a good thing. That said, we haven't seen the spray drift to be a huge issue. With some species, you know, once they're established, they've got an incredible underground root system, so they've got a lot of reserves to draw on. You may see these species kind of the leaves curl up or turn brown or not bloom, things like that, but generally they're going to come back the next year. If they're directly sprayed with herbicide, that's going to be a kind of a different story. And that's where, as I mentioned, just kind of being as conscientious as possible, watching your wind speed, watching your boom height, you know, some of those things, just while you're speeding or while you're spraying, excuse me, is going to be the best thing. And if you're worried about that, that's where I would encourage, you know, more the use of edge of field strips, where you're only going to be interacting really with one side of that prairie would be one thing. And then just jump in real quick on the herbicide residue. Yeah, absolutely. So it's important to look at what was applied last season, whether you're talking about corn or soybeans, because we have seen some of the herbicides that are used on soybeans. I think Flex Star, just off the top of my head, is one of the main ones, where the plant back time for some of the small seeded forb species or flower species can be as much as 18 months. So just making sure you know what was planted in the previous season before going ahead and investing a lot of money in a prairie seeding. Keeping track of that would be one thing. Otherwise, doing just kind of a simple bioassay where you could go out, grab samples of that soil from off of the surface or the top few inches, you know, just putting those into some kind of just a pot or a pan or some kind of growing container, and putting some seeds in that and just seeing if those seeds will germinate and actually grow. If they germinate and they die right away, then you might have an herbicide carryover issue where you'd want to delay your planting.
Okay, and then we have time for a couple more questions yet. Is there, or does excess nutrient sediment runoff in row crops degrade the strip over time? Do we have weeds taking over the strip at a certain point? Yeah, I don't know, once again, who wants to answer that, but.
If it's fertilizer for row crops, it's also fertilizer for prairie plants. And so in some instances, you can see some massive prairie plants. You want to watch your nutrient management in any agronomic situation, but it's better to capture it there in the prairie strip than it is for it to run into the waterway. I don't know Tim, if you'd agree with that sentiment, I think, but.
Yeah, and on a separate research project at Iowa State, what we've seen, fertilized prairie versus non-fertilized prairie. So using a nitrogen fertilizer, what it does is, as Andy said, it makes the above ground biomass of these prairie plants get much larger. And then it really doesn't have any effect on the roots. So the roots stay about the same, but that above ground growth just kind of explodes. I wouldn't worry about that too much. The biggest thing over the long term that you need to be concerned about with kind of any prairie in the state of Iowa, but especially prairie that's in a row crop setting, is the invasion of woody species. So your cottonwoods, willows, dogwoods, just all those kind of usual suspects, watching that they don't take over, because they're always going to be kind of trying to invade. I think more so than some of the herbaceous weeds and things that you'd be worried about with more nitrogen.
Okay.
Maybe with the exception of Canada thistle.
Yeah, and brome.
And brome,
So
yeah.
there's a couple bad apples that can often get ahead of you, but yeah, shrubs and trees are definitely one of them. And then cool season grasses like brome and quackgrass can be pretty tough to stop the spread of.
And that's a really good point. And, scouting is going to be really important. And I think what we're keying on with, say, brome and the Canada thistle is just those perennial weeds. It's not going to be so much of a problem with the kind of the annual weeds that really are going to have a hard time germinating in that established prairie. But yeah, your perennial weeds, and just kind of seeing what you have out there to begin with. Because if you have a Canada thistle problem in the field before you plant the prairie, the prairie's not magically going to make the weed issue go away. So if you have a weed issue where you're going into seeding your prairie, get that under control as much as possible at first, or otherwise plan on some regular scouting and then spot use of herbicide or some other treatment for those perennial weed species.
And that's a good point. And you hear often people will repeat, prairie can be low maintenance, but it's not no maintenance. So you do need to be out there, scouting, especially in those first years, because if you don't allow the Canada thistle to get a toehold, it's a lot easier to control later.
Also make sure that you're real confident about, plant ID. That's also important. And so that, especially when you get into some of those grass ID, can be tough. So making sure what smooth brome would look like compared to some other stuff is helpful. And I would say another thing to think about, as far as early season stuff and annual weeds, annual weeds are, in my view, sort of responsive to the situation rather than causing problems. So if you see a lot of annual weeds, you're typically dealing with a situation where you had very poor native establishment. And that's why you see the first 2 years, which, you don't really have very many native species because they're, still establishing. That's when you have your annual weeds. So if you're running around year 3 and 4, where you have a lot of annual weeds, it could, go out and take a look to make sure you have the native species there, because often that's a good indication that there's very low native plant density, which would necessitate reseeding.
Okay, and then our next question is, where do you get your filler and what is the cost?
So for rice holes, if you're depending on what kind of volume you're looking at, you're probably going to just go to some company, and this is not me saying that they're the only company to go to, but a mail order company like A.M. Leonard would sell rice holes in one 50-pound compressed bag. And I want to say it's like maybe $10 a bag plus shipping. And if you want to buy a full pallet, you can get it from there too, but you might want to talk to your local co-op, or you might want to talk to some of the native seed dealers in the state. I'm not sure that they really want to be in the business of handling those things because they are pretty bulky. So you might want to ask. I know AM Leonard is in the business, and companies like that are in the business of selling such items to the general public.
Okay, and I just want to remind everyone, it's around 20. If you have to go, that's totally fine. I'm sharing the contact information for Andrew and Justin and posted in the chat the websites for the ISU Strips team, so you can get connected with them, as well as the Tallgrass Prairie Center if you want just more information generally. We do have a couple more questions, but if you have to hop off, I totally understand. One question that we do have that I think is important is, do roots become a problem in tile lines or tiling systems in agricultural fields?
So Tim and I can both address this, I think. So we actually bought a tile camera and have been looking at that this year, and have been out on, I think probably 10 or 12 different farms so far, looking under prairie strips and looking under old CRP ground and saturated buffers and some of these grassed waterways. And so far what we found is we don't yet have enough evidence to conclusively state it. Most of the evidence that we have gathered shows that it is those woody species, like Tim said, the cottonwoods or the other tree species or shrub species that have come in. I actually was just out on a farm a month or so ago, and we were trying to go into a saturated buffer, and we couldn't even get into the tile outlet. And so the farm that we were on, the guy had a backhoe, so he dug it up, and we were able to identify that it was a cottonwood root that was coming from almost 60 feet away. And we could actually see the root. When we dug the hole, we saw the root and it going right into the tile line. Likely not, would be my supposition, but not impossible. Tim, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I think Andy, that was a great answer. I mean, we've looked in several tiles and we've seen kind of side-by-side plots of continuous corn and prairie and about the same amount of roots from just a regular corn plant as what we've seen under prairie that was about 10 years old. And there's a video on our website that kind of summarizes some of those. So if you look at the prairiestrips.org website, you can see that. I think depending upon how the tile was laid, how old the tile is, kind of what the conditions are, what the water situation is, it could be a problem. But from all the different looks that we've had inside the tile, we haven't seen that yet. I mean, it ends up, the reed canary and the woody species end up being kind of more of the problem so far.
Okay, thank you. We have a question that says, what seed or seed mix is best for sandy soil where others will not take? I do want to point out that I put in our seed mix calculator in the chat, where you can toy around with different species and it'll give you the cost as well as the recommended seed mix for that. So does anyone want to tackle that question though?
Yeah, I'll follow up with your description page that, so if you wanted to use our seed mix calculator, you can set your county, you can set the project size, and then the key for you would be to make sure that you set the, if you're working with sandy soil, set the soil conditions or soil type or soil moisture to xeric or dry. So that'll give you a suite of species that are a lot more tolerant to droughty soils. So those sites can be tough, and sometimes the establishment is not quite as fast on those sites as they are in good soils. But over time, typically things look pretty good. So be patient on those sites.
Another question is, are there any suggestions for getting prairie plants into pasture land, hilly, untillable pasture? Anyone want to take that?
Hilly, untillable pasture.
That's tough. Doing any kind of, integrating any kind of prairie plants into other perennial vegetation is hard. There's, to my knowledge, no real way to do it without killing the established vegetation. Perhaps, perhaps you could do really aggressive mowing over long periods of time, but over long periods of time, that's probably going to kill the perennial pasture that you're working with. So it's hard. I don't know that we have a good answer for that. I think there's some science yet to be done on that kind of question. So that's what I would say is, I don't know. It would be hard. It's a hard question.
Okay, and then we have a very general question consisting of what are your burning recommendations?
Typically as much as feasible. Often, that usually means like every couple of years. You typically don't want to burn annually. That often will favor warm season grass domination, which we don't really want that when we're dealing with a diverse stand. Every 3 years is good, but sometimes that's pretty optimistic. Varying when you burn is good too. If you can do a fall burn and then do a spring burn, just variation is good. But 3 to 5 years is typically the recommendation. And on the more frequent end, especially if you have issues with shrubs, more frequent is really important.
Okay. Interesting question. How should they best sell or recommend prairie strips or offer them or recommend them into large ag landscapes?
Tim, you can have that one.
Yeah, I'm your guy. So that's tough. I mean, there can be a lot of resistance, or at least perceived resistance, to getting prairie out there in an ag landscape. But I would just really focus on, at first, trying to kind of meet that person, whoever you're interacting with, just kind of meet them where they stand. I mean, there can't necessarily be a general recommendation that's going to work for everybody, because somebody might be interested in preserving a skipper moth and someone might be interested in maintaining their bottom line. I mean, you have no idea. So it's kind of figuring out what the goals that person has would be kind of the first thing. And then looking at the multifunctionality of prairie. It really can do a lot of things for you. If you're interested in hunting, there's a lot of benefits there. If you're interested in clean water, there's a lot of benefits there, or any number of pollinators, things like that. For most folks, especially in farming, it's a business, and your bottom line is going to be what's driving a lot of the decisions or making the prairie make economic sense. While you're not going to make the same amount of money as being a farmer operator farming prairie or having prairie on your land as you would farming corn and soybeans, you can focus on areas that are maybe lower producing. That can be a win-win right away. So money from the USDA for the CRP program might outpace certainly making zero money or losing money on a bad producing piece of ground. And we really have a lot of that precision ag technology that can pinpoint those areas on the farm that aren't hitting your break-even point. So that would be one way to think about. Otherwise, equipment is just getting larger and larger, and it seems some years the windows for planting and for harvest can be very small, and sometimes seem to be getting smaller. Taking areas that are really small, strange point rows, a lot of turning around where there's just a lot of inefficiency with that large equipment, sometimes seeding those areas down to prairie can add some efficiency there. So there's a lot of different benefits. There's a lot of different positives about prairie. And I think just, again, kind of finding the goals or the reason that person might be interested in prairie, knowing a little bit more about them, I think that can be the way. There's not really an across the board reason, but again, this is Iowa. We're right in the middle of the tallgrass prairie landscape. It is our heritage. It's something that we should all be proud about and we should know more about. So I think there's a lot of reasons that everybody in the state should get more interested in prairie.
We have 2 questions left. A question coming in says, for fairly narrow buffers, does brome impact strip edges more? Would a large wildlife units have less effect since they're usually a fourth of a section? So basically, do edges of prairie strips have more brome concentration than others?
Edges of fields are always more difficult to keep clean. And I don't know, Tim, do you at Iowa State have any documentation showing that with prairie strips in particular?
No, I don't have any research to fall back on here, but yeah, again, just kind of anecdotally what I've seen out at fields, you know, when you're up against the edge, especially, you know, if you're against, say, a ditch that's in brome, or you're against a land that's owned by someone else and you don't have control over that, you know, it can be hard to have control over what's happening. Brome, I mean, it just kind of depends. If you have brome that's in that other land use up against your prairie, you could have some trouble with it. Typically out in the edge of or in the field, what we see is more, you know, if you get some of that spray drift or something like that, you might end up with more like your annual weeds. Like what Justin was saying, it's kind of a product of that disturbance. But yeah, I don't know. I don't have a great answer for that.
2 questions left again. Any experience with dormant native seeding over coconut mats and then with hydro mulch on top?
Yeah, so I'll speak to the coconut mulch. I guess before I worked at Iowa State, I worked in the Twin Cities, and we did a lot of large scale landscape restoration, stream remeanders, just all kinds of things like that. And where we would do these stream remeanders, essentially we would take what was a steep slope, and we'd kind of reduce that back to a 2-to-1 slope, and then that would be covered with this coir fabric, and then we'd seed, you know, just kind of a broadcast seed, and then generally there'd be some kind of a hay or some type of mulch over top of that. It depends on the area that you're talking about, but certainly that's going to be cost prohibitive for a lot of prairie planting. So, you know, that was kind of the standard procedure for riparian restoration. It kind of depends on the area that you're talking about, but certainly like the field that Andy and Justin were in, you'd never want to do something like that just because of the cost.
Yeah, and I would say that is you know, there's a reason for using that cocoa and mulch. Is its erosion control is sort of primary to the, you know, the maximizing seed soil contact and establishment. If you can, don't do anything like mulching and stuff like that unless you know it's going to break down really fast, because that, you know, you want to have as much opportunity for the native seeds to establish and germinate as you can. And when you're on a, you know, easy slopes and stuff, that's what you want to do. But yeah, when it makes sense, when it's small, yeah, when it is like riparian situations, yeah, then the erosion, it's kind of a question of what is the primary objective, or what's the overriding objective? Is it erosion control, or is it, you know, maximizing establishment?
Our last question, and then we're going to end this webinar, is you've addressed herbicide drift, but how do you feel about pesticide drift on these areas?
I know Tim and I can probably both speak to that for sure. I've had a lot of conversations with folks at the Xerxes Society about this, and like Iowa is the most altered landscape of any state in the union. And so of the 50 states, we have the most altered landscape here. And so getting more habitat or prairie, tallgrass prairie out on the landscape is probably a net benefit. You know, even if we do have some insecticide drift, I'm not encouraging insecticide drift. There definitely is the possibility of that, and fungicide drift for that matter. It's again the same with the herbicide though, you know, watch your wind speed and direction, make sure that you're applying according to the label directions. You know, be scouting your field so you're only applying insecticides or fungicides or whatever side it is when you actually need it, as opposed to just putting it out there because somebody sold it to you. You know, good practices. So I don't know, Tim, if you have something to add to that, feel free.
Yeah, that's great. And really the last thing that I would say, we have a lot of different aspects of pollinator research that are occurring kind of ongoing right now. And it does take some time because you need multiple field seasons and a lot of studies, but we're looking at neonicotinoids and fungicide and a lot of different drift into these strips and taking pollen samples and collecting bees and taking vegetation samples and just all kinds of things and seeing what the ability of the prairie is to filter out some of those different ag chemicals. So just kind of stay tuned. And I think a lot of that will at least kind of add to the conversation here over the next few years.
Okay, we don't have any more questions. Do you guys have any final notes or final thoughts? Otherwise, it's going to be the end of the webinar.
Thanks for joining us. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. We're happy to talk to you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. Like I said, if you missed a part or want to just view it again, the recording will be posted shortly. Thank you again for attending. We really appreciate it.